we're getting reports of deaths linked to hunger there in Somalia. What's the situation on the ground?
Well, thank you very much. So Somalia is in a very dire situation right now, both in terms of food insecurity and malnutrition. You can see that on the ground. The country is on the brink of famine unless we can get sufficient assistance to the people who need it the most. I mean, there is a real risk that people will die in these conditions, especially young children and the elderly. And it's likely to be happening already. In fact, I've been on the ground across the last couple of weeks in Mogadishu, in Dolo, with members of the media, and we are hearing stories from people that they have lost loved ones as a result of this drought. We don't yet have official figures on mortality rates. The UN uses multiple means to get this information during crises, and there is ongoing analysis on this right now. It's very important to make sure we are accurate in getting this information. But as this crisis continues, as the hunger crisis in Somalia continues, I'm afraid we might expect those mortality rates to continue going up.
That is just a grim picture that you've painted for us. We also understand that many needy people are still not getting their rations. Why is this the case?
Yeah, okay. So from the WFP perspective, I'm afraid the answer is simply a lack of funding. So right now, there are 6 million people in Somalia facing critical levels of food insecurity. The WFP, the World Food Programme of the United Nations, we are scaling up our life-saving food and nutrition response to try to reach 4.1 million people, but we have a serious funding gap. We don't have enough resources. We haven't received enough resources. That means that we are having to make incredibly hard choices. We are having to prioritize our limited resources to reach the people who need it most desperately, the emphasis on saving lives, but that means we are having to take from the hungry to feed the starving.
And Petroc, when do you expect this hunger crisis to be resolved? I mean, you're talking about a funding gap. Are you hopeful it's going to improve?
Well, if we're talking about the context, as I think you know, this drought is a result of 3 consecutive failed rainy seasons. We are currently in a 4th rainy season, and the projections just aren't looking great. There has been some rainfall, it's been scattered, it's been below average, and I've just been reading some new data about these rains potentially finishing early. So I'm afraid it's difficult to see an immediate end in sight in terms of drought. And for the hunger crisis, we know that it is critical to respond early to the risk of famine to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. And that's what we're working to do. But unless we close that funding gap, which right now for WFP alone, just for life-saving assistance is some 234 million, unless we close that funding gap, we don't have the resources we need to avert what is already a crisis from turning into humanitarian catastrophe.